up, y'all? Wow. I haven't done a video in a long time. It feels like ages. Here's the deal. I was just, I've had a couple of situations lately that have been real examples for me of like the ways in which white folks don't actually understand right relationship. And so I realized that I have been, talking about right relationship as if it is something that's obvious. Now, it feels obvious to me, right? But I recognize that inside of an culture that has indoctrinated all of us into scarcity, but very specifically indoctrinated white folks into the notion of scarcity, right? Into the notion of hoarding, into not enoughness, into and individualism. And scarcity and hoarding and individualism are very particular dynamics when you don't have to rely on community and neighbors and extended family for survival, right? And so there is a nature of giving. There is a nature of if I have, you have, that is embedded inside of cultures that have been marginalized because it is necessary for our survival. And I recognize that inside of whiteness as a cultural dynamic, that doesn't exist. And, I didn't grow up in white neighborhoods. I either grew up in sort of mixed community neighborhoods as a result of being a military kid, or I grew up in black neighborhoods. But, if you needed 2 eggs, you knocked on your neighbor's door and you asked to borrow 2 eggs. If you needed a cup of sugar or a cup of flour, a cup of milk, your grandma sent you down the street to, 2 doors down to ask Miss Phillips, Miss, Baker, Miss Green, if they had that. And the same happened vice versa, right? And that was part of the nature of community, right? Is that we did that for one another. And so there is this dynamic where we just understand that as a way to show up. And I'm discovering that that's just not true for white folks. And so what I'm noticing inside of whiteness and inside of the machinations of white supremacist delusion is the instinct is to keep more, right? Is to keep the most and to give just a little. I've seen this at play in some really interesting dynamics that I want to highlight. So one of them was an event for, a request for an event. And it was a request for an event from an organization, a philanthropic organization, right? So individuals who are into philanthropy, which means they got wealth, right? Like philanthropy is, how do I give away extra money I have, right? That's my understanding, at least, of philanthropy. And they were unable to meet my minimum dollar, right? My minimum dollar ask for events. And I found it perplexed. I was perplexed and I was mind boggled. Bondoogled. I don't even know if that's a word, but it's a word today. I was like, oh, and I know that these are people who are familiar with my work, right? Like I know them to be people who are familiar with my work. And so I imagine that they are people who are familiar with me in this conversation about right relationship. And I was like, obviously there's something missing in the dynamic of right relationship that you would reach out as a group of white folks with wealth, mostly white folks at least, with wealth, and ask a black activist, artist, creator, right, to work with you, but then haggle them about their price. Right? I was like, that's not right. That is not right relationship, because right relationship for me understands context. And then context informs the way that we move. So context number one in that situation is their own access to wealth. Do we have it? Yes, the answer is yes. And I don't, and it doesn't matter if like your line item, like, oh, we only budgeted this for this and that for that, right? Like that's arbitrary and made up, and you can make it up differently, right? So that's one piece of that, right? And then the second piece of that is, so that's a place where there's obviously not a consideration about the context, your own personal context to resource. And that is so important in this conversation of right relationship is, what do you have? And can you be honest about what you have? Right? And can you move from the instinct to protect and hoard what you have? Right? Can you move from contraction to release? Right? To like, oh, I'm open with what I have. Now, how would I move when I'm open with what I have? So that's step number one around considering right relationship. Step number two is, in terms of context, is who is it that I'm in the relationship with? And what is the dynamic of power and positionality inside of that relationship? You, a collective of wealthy white people, and me, a Black, queer, neurodivergent person who, regardless of how much money I have, I don't have as much money as them. That's what I do know. I'm certain. And so based on power and positionality, what is the appropriate, based on power and positionality, paired with what is my openness in the context of what I have, rather than my contracted space in the context of what I have, what is the appropriate offering? Right? So again, what I'm asking us to think about is not only what, like, what can I give? It's also what's appropriate. What's appropriate inside of this dynamic, inside of this positionality and power dynamic? What's appropriate? And then the other piece about that is what is appropriate contextually and historically, right? So I'm going to give you another example. I've shared that I'm in New Zealand, that I got to New Zealand via a fellowship for social impact change makers. And this fellowship has a lot of rich people in it, like really, really rich people in it. Multi-hundred millionaires. And there are a handful, small number, right, of, folks from marginalized identities also inside of this fellowship. And there have been two instances where folks of marginalized identities have been in situations where they needed living resource, like, basic needs resource. And the idea that, and one of them is indigenous to this land, and the other is, racially marginalized. And I, my head exploded when I received the request to support with funds. Not because, of course, I would support with funds, but in a organization started by millionaires that has access to millionaires, multimillionaires, the idea that there should be anybody in this organization trying to meet their basic needs is mind-boggling to me. But beyond that, that an indigenous person in this land, because all these people who started this are not from here. Let me be clear. They are not indigenous to this land. They're immigrants. And have used the resource of indigenous folks in this land to add credibility to this project. And the idea that there is an indigenous person in this land who is in need of basic needs and can't get those needs met, such that we're group raising resource, is a lack of historical context about right relationship. The historical context of right relationship is that whatever is is here, right? That we ensure that indigenous people are taken care of first, right? That we ensure that the people who are the most marginalized inside of this have what they need, and that nobody should ever, like, I don't even understand why it would have to get down to my level, because the people who make way, 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 way more than me, who are way, way above me in terms of privilege and power, should have taken care of that immediately. Because that would be right relationship inside of the context of all of the dynamics that I just shared. But because white folks are so disconnected from what actual right relationship looks like, and what the pieces and parts of it, the context that should be taken into consideration when thinking about what right relationship really looks like, right? And part of the reason that there's that disconnection is because if you really sat with it, you would recognize that you should probably give away almost all your money. That's what's real, but we're not even saying that. And that's not even what I'm asking. But I am asking that you should absolutely, absolutely, absolutely be thinking about the full context of your resource, of the person it is that you are asking to be in a relationship with, and the historical context of power and positionality and the dynamics therein that inform that relationship. That is how you show up in reciprocity in a way that is in right relationship. And I'm really encouraging folks to start thinking about that. What does that look like in your life? What would it look like if you weren't hoarding? Hoarding wealth. Hoarding resource. What would it look like if you weren't operating from, I can give you a little bit of this? Questions to think about. All right, y'all.